Hello and welcome to our new video series on ASME B31.3. This video series is generally intended for the people who are working towards or studying for API ICP 570 examination. But this video series is also going to be good for the people who just want to learn about process pipes and what are the requirements while doing the construction of process pipe. In this video series, we'll be talking about ASME B31.3 code. This code is a construction code for process piping systems. This is going to be starkly different from the approaches taken in API 570. API 570 is generally intended for the piping systems that are placed in service, whereas ASME B31.3 is generally going to be concerned with the requirements of original construction. So this generally means is that B31.3 is generally used by the manufacturers of the said piping system, whereas API 570 is going to be more important for the people who are doing authorized repairs or in-service examinations of the piping systems. ASME B31.3 is again a fairly huge amount of code with several references to different codes. This code will tell you various requirements. So this code will tell you about the scope of B31.3, where this code can be used. It will also tell you about the design requirements. It will also tell you about the fabrication requirements, material selection requirements. It will also tell you about standards which can be used. It will also tell you about how to do inspection. All of these things are going to be present in ASME B31.3 code. Again, it's a fairly huge amount of code, but not the entire code needs to be understood when you are talking about API 570 examination. API 570 examination is generally going to be more concerned with the materials that you use, the pressure testing requirements. Then it will also be more concerned with the selection of the material, and all of these will generally be referred in ASME B31.3. That is going to be the original construction code for your process piping system. So fairly, when you talk about this, the ASME B31.3, only 40 to 50 pages are important when you are studying with respect to API 570 examination. But if you just want to learn about the process piping systems, in that case the entire code is going to be very much important, because this will tell you about the procedural requirements that has to be followed when the original construction of the piping system is getting carried out. So when you talk about ASME B31.3, this code is divided into various chapters. The chapters are something like this. So the first chapter is going to talk about the scope of ASME B31.3. Chapter 2 is going to talk about design requirements. Chapter 3 is going to talk about the materials required for the design, or what should be the material that you can use for the design, what would be the yield stress, what would be the impact testing requirements, and all of those things. Chapter 4 is going to be standards. Chapter 5 is going to be fabrication, assembly, and erection of the piping system. Chapter 6 is going to be inspection. Chapter 7 is for non-metallic piping, that is most cases FRP pipings. Chapter 8 is going to be piping for category M service, and chapter 9 is going to be high pressure piping systems. Out of all of these, for API 570 examination, scope is important, design requirement is important, material requirements is important, fabrication, assembly, and erection mechanisms is important, and inspection criteria is important. Just have to focus on that for API 570 examination. The other things can be fairly neglected. Okay. Now, in ASME B31.3, there are various other requirements. So ASME B31.3 generally divide the piping system based on the service category. This service category is based on what kind of fluid is flowing inside the piping system. This is starkly different from the requirements given in API 570. In API 570, the classification of the piping system was done on the consequences and the probability of failure. So in API 570, the classification is done something like class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 4, where class 1 is very risky, it has a higher probability of failure and higher consequence of failure, whereas class 4 is generally considered to be non-toxic and non-flammable services. But in ASME B31.3, the piping service categories is defined by the fluid that is flowing inside the pipe, and it is classified into four. It is going to be a category D service, which is essentially a low risk service. In most cases, it is going to be non-toxic and non-flammable. Normal service, which is a default service for your ASME B31.3. So whatever the requirements is given for ASME B31.3, that is default for normal service requirements. Category M services, that is going to be for toxic fluids. And high pressure service, if your system is running in high pressure, then it has to be considered as a high pressure service. The next thing that we have to understand is that while doing hydrostatic test, or when considering the thickness requirements can be given by both ASME B31.3 as well as API 570 examination, but the approach in both of these codes are slightly different. In ASME B31.3, generally the thickness requirements for the piping system based on the pressure is given on the basis of the Brodmann's formula. So these are two variations on the Brodmann's formula. This formula is known as equation 3a, whereas this formula is known as equation 3b. Okay, we'll talk about it later on when we go inside of the code, and we'll do a deep dive into this. But this is how thickness requirement is carried out if the pressure is given. Again, consequently, if you know the thickness, you can also find the pressure that can be sustained by that thickness. The approach taken by API 570 is based on Barlow's formula. Okay? So that it means that API 570 bases the thickness requirements on Barlow formula, and ASME B31.3 bases the thickness requirements on Brodmann's formula, so which we have to use. Generally, you can use either of these. If you don't have a high temperature service, then both of these formulas are going to give you similar results. If you are using high temperature service, then generally a Brodmann's formula would be taken into consideration, but that depends on what kind of temperature requirement you are running on. Finally, stress requirements. So stress requirements for the given material, or stress requirement for the piping systems that for the material that you are using in the piping system, is also going to be given in ASME B31.3. That is the original construction code. So the allowable stress for each material of construction is given in table A1 of ASME B31.3, as well as brittle fracture or impact testing requirements are also given in ASME B31.3. In ASME B31.3, you have impact testing requirements. You have a table A1 that shows you the minimum temperature at which the material can be used without impact testing. Okay, so these are going to be generally the areas where the examination questions for API 570 ICP examination are going to arise, which takes into consideration the ASME B31.3 code. In this video series, we are going to talk very much in detail about ASME B31.3, but again, it has to be understood that not everything is required by API ICP examination. Most of the things that are required by ICP examination are generally going to be related to fluid services. It is going to be related to design requirements. It is going to be related to materials or construction. It is going to be related to pressure testing. It is going to be related to impact testing requirements, and it is also going to be related to the heat treatment requirement. All of these things are generally going to be taken into focus when we are talking about ASME B31.3 with the approach of studying for API ICP examination. But if your approach is not for API ICP examination, then the entire video series has to be looked upon, which will give you much better understanding about the process piping systems as defined in the code ASME B31.3. That's it for this video. This was just the introduction for this series. In the next video, we'll be talking about the first chapter, that is going to be scope for ASME B31.3 process piping code. That's it for this video. Thank you. And go in the next video, we'll be talking about ASME B31.3 in much more detail in this series. Thank you.